Let's go live on YouTube. And we're live.
Woo-hoo.
It is Tuesday, January 26th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. And I have a story to tell you.
Oh, good.
It is a story of hyperbole and graciousness. As many of you viewers of the show know, I have a propensity to invite people on the show by tweeting at them as though they were already coming on the show. For example, at so-and-so, I assume you're coming on tonight to talk about blank, or which, by the way, almost always works.
Yeah, I know. You've had good success.
I mean, it's kind of it hasn't bagged us Taylor Swift yet, but we're working on that. And sometimes I will just say at so-and-so, so when are you coming on in lieu of fun? And they will almost always respond with a date. And so this is called the presumptuousness of the small, because networks don't do that. But because we are small, unresourced, and just two people being jerks, we can get away with stuff like that. So the other day I was thinking about what are the big policy changes that we are going to have in the Biden administration. And I thought, boy, nothing's going to be bigger, faster than immigration. And I thought, who do I want to talk about immigration? So I tweeted, and the record will bear me out on this. I tweeted at Dara Lind, so when are you coming on in lieu of fun to talk about immigration in the Biden administration? And rather to my surprise, Dara DM'd me almost immediately that she had been anxiously waiting for this invitation for months. And so we quickly made an arrangement for Dara to come on the show. This was the first time I had been aware that anybody was anxiously awaiting an invitation from In Lieu of Fun, but I was delighted by it. And then today, in an act of flagrant disregard for the truth, Dara tweeted that she had successfully harassed me into inviting her on the show. And so I just want to say, as I said on Twitter, that, Dara's definition of harassment is accepting invitations when extended. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we are allowed to have a conversation with Dara Lind about immigration policy in the new administration. So let's just get into it. Dara? I should say, Dara is one of the hosts of the Weeds podcast on Vox. She is also an immigration reporter for ProPublica, and was for a number of years Vox's principal writer on immigration matters. And she's just one of the people who knows immigration policy kind of better than everybody else. So get us started. What has already changed in the few days of the Biden administration? And this will lead to the next question, which is going to be, just giving you fair warning, what's going to change in the next few days?
I have much better answers to the first question than the second. One of the weird things about my situation right now is that covering a fast-changing policy area without being a quote-unquote beat here's what happened today reporter means that I am kind of keeping up with this stuff in my spare time. But the other thing is that some of the things that have already changed as of this afternoon changed back, because we are back in litigation world and in immigration policy. Immigration policy has been fought through the courts for the last 5 years and looks like it's going to get fought through the courts for the next 5. And I guess I'm glad that all the federal appellate I taught myself in 2017 is still useful. But so, okay. When the Biden administration, took office on Wednesday, they dropped the talking points for a big day one piece of legislation, which, as we know, even if it were in fact the first piece of legislation they want to move, it isn't, would still take a while. So bracket that whole thing. They also signed a bunch of executive orders, some of which actually had a meaningful immediate effect, most notably reversing what are called the Muslim bans or travel bans, the series executive orders signed by Trump that prevent people from being admitted to the U.S. based on coming from particular countries that were supposed to be terror hotbeds. There are plenty of other layers of legal immigration bans that are still in place. So many of the people who would be able to benefit from that are kind of still blocked for COVID reasons or other reasons. But it is the sort of thing that once the pandemic goes, there are some people who can benefit already, and once the pandemic goes away, more people will be able to. There was also some stuff that was less, either a little bit symbolic or placeholdery. There was one on DACA that, because there's also pending litigation on that, didn't need to happen. There wasn't any kind of legal substance to it yet, but it's kind of a DACA TK. And then there was one on interior immigration enforcement, which itself didn't do anything, or at least didn't do a whole lot, but which prompted a memo from the acting secretary of DHS to the immigration enforcement component saying, all the guidance you got from Trump on who is a priority for deportation is now has been rescinded. Instead, we're going to work to come up with some enforcement priorities on who should be for deportation. In the meantime, nobody gets deported for 100 days, starting Friday.
All right. So
that part has now been is no longer in effect as of this afternoon.
Wait, the 100-day ban on deportations?
Yes, the moratorium has been subjected to a temporary restraining order. The pause has been paused.
Okay, so let's talk through this from the point of view of a variety of different actors who may be affected. If you are an Iranian American whose mother wants to visit, I take it your mother can no longer not visit because she lives in Iran, but she can probably still no longer visit because we don't let people in because of COVID. Is that right?
I'm pretty sure that Iran is covered in the country-specific COVID travel bans. But even above and beyond that, most categories of immigrant visas to the U.S. were suspended. They suspended all approvals of them last year for the sake of the economic recovery. So it's very difficult. There's pending litigation on that. It is there is a sense that the Biden administration isn't going to let those stand because it's not like the COVID. It's not like the bans of countries that have bad COVID outbreaks. It's not something that kind of aligns with the we got to get this pandemic under control message, but they haven't done it yet. So, and there isn't necessarily clear communication, on whether we know there's a batch of executive orders happening on Friday. We don't know for sure whether really those would be included. So there are a lot of people who are still subjected to this because the Trump administration decided last year that letting people's family members into the U.S. on immigrant visas would violate the need of American workers to be put first in the economic recovery.
Okay, but it's fair to say it's fair to say a major roadblock to your mother coming to visit has been lifted, but there are still some others, both I'm speaking normatively from both legit and less legit. Is that?
Yeah, or to speak less normatively, there are barriers, some of which are in place for COVID reasons, and some of which are in place for reasons that a Biden administration has expressed are legitimate, and some of which are reasons that they have expressed are not legitimate. Yeah.
Okay. Second category of person.
This is like populism, no limit.
Second category of person, a DACA kid who's now 25, has no criminal record of any kind, had applied for and received DACA protection, and that person's parents under DAPA. How is their situation different, if at all, from 3 weeks ago?
So DAPA was never actually put into effect. It was proposed and then enjoined shortly before it would have opened up applications in 2015 by a judge in Texas, Andrew Hannon. So the situation for the parents is that as of 3 weeks ago, they weren't, they might, depending on whether they had final orders of removal, depending on whether they had criminal records, they might not have been considered priorities for deportation under the Trump administration, but like the Trump administration's position was, if we find you and you're unauthorized, we have every right to arrest you and put you in deportation. So that definitely a risk existed. And even though ICE's actual enforcement posture was not always as aggressive under Trump as it kind of would have been assumed to be, the risk is still there, and the risk creates massive chilling effects, right? Like,
so no difference for the parents,
right? I mean, well, it's like theoretically, nothing legally actionably different, but in theory, the message has now been sent that like they wouldn't have to risk, getting. If say one of them had like a years old final order of removal that they may not have known about, they could have gotten picked up and deported immediately 3 weeks ago. Theoretically, they could under the moratorium. Theoretically, they can now. For the kid, because again, in a separate piece of litigation out of New York, when Trump tried to end the DACA program in 2017, that continued through, the Supreme Court ruled that his 2017 effort wasn't, violated the Procedure Act. Subsequent to that, the Trump administration under Acting Secretary Chad Wolf didn't do anything for a month to like reopen application, to allow people to continue to renew, that kind of thing. Didn't reopen applications, and then a month later put out a memo saying, we're reviewing this program. We are going to change renewals to only be eligible for 1 year instead of 2. And we're not reopening it to people who were eligible but who didn't apply, before we closed it, or who weren't yet eligible. They weren't old enough because they weren't 15 yet, but who turned 15 after 2017. The judge in New York said, you don't get to just ignore Supreme Court ruling for a month and then put out a memo saying, actually, we're changing the terms. We have altered the deal. Pray we do not alter it further. And so toward the end of last year, the judge ordered the Trump administration to fully stat DACA to pre-2017 status quo and reopen applications to anybody who was eligible under the original terms of the program. Again, nothing actually needed to change when Biden got into office. What they did was sign an executive order kind of reinforcing DACA, which doesn't have, there isn't really legal substance to it, but it's basically a signal that if something happens to the program, they will still take steps to protect that population. Because the reason that I mentioned the name of the judge who stopped DAPA, Andrew Hannon, is that litigation wasn't originally about the original DACA program, right? Like originally in filings, everyone who was, the states that were challenging it said, look, we understand this isn't about the existing program. This is just about whether it's constitutional to expand it and to add this new group of people into it. As it evolved, it became a of DACA, and ultimately, this is actually this was part of the timeline of why the Trump administration acted when it did in 2017. They were a group of Republican attorneys general had said, we are going to sue in this same court over DACA if you don't rescind the program yourself. And so because he tried and failed, they went forward with the, okay, we're just going to argue that DACA is unconstitutional. And a ruling to that effect could come any day. There was a hearing like right after the election. There was definitely a chance that it was going to happen before inauguration. And so the Biden team has had to be in a posture of like, well, we got to be ready in case. And if the ruling comes down and says you should never have granted this protection to this group of people, they're going to have to figure out how to provide some kind of alternate form of legal protection. There are a couple of avenues they could take with that. There isn't clear signal on what they will do. One would expect that because it would have to, it would only happen depending on what ruling comes out of Texas, that it would be, it might be something of a game time decision. But the executive order basically was kind of a signal that like they're aware of this issue and they will do what they have to do, in terms of future executive actions if additional steps are needed to protect the population.
Yeah, so this is so great. I want to just also say, and I hope that we can kind of turn to this at some point, I think that like you've been doing immigration, like even in college, from like looking at some of like your CV and stuff, you've been focused on this for so long. And I do want to say that like it does seem to me that that the American attention to immigration waxes and wanes. And going into Trump, it was definitely not a hot button issue, particularly for progressives necessarily. I mean, it was for some. But it was certainly not as kind of as what it is now. So this is just, I wanted to like table that for 1 second to just say, you've been doing this forever. What is that like to like, to all of a sudden have it become what it's become? But more specifically, I want to just touch on the fact like of the EOs. So you talked about the executive orders, these flurry of executive orders on immigration. And so what do you think is the correct response to these executive orders in the media and among lawyers and advocates, like in terms of, them as a medium, like as a way of creating law in the first place, but also just as kind of like staking out long-term priorities for an administration? And where do you see the Biden administration going? Is it going to pick up? Is it going to try to just erase everything Trump did and pick up? Is that possible? Or is it going to like pick up like kind of the mantle where Obama administration left off? What are you thinking in this this new administration?
So there's a ton there. I could probably talk for ages just about like the experience of being an immigration reporter under Trump, and I really want to do that. Both because like that's not why I'm here, and like I don't know, it's bad enough to be it's bad enough to be a white woman with a prominent position on a beat that disproportionately harms people who are not white. I wouldn't want to become the story either for journalistic or for like equity reasons. But I think it's been, I've been worried for a while that the attention to immigration under Trump was going to turn into immigration is relevant because of Donald Trump, and that it would fade once Biden got into office. And like, it's a little too soon to tell. There's certainly ways in which it seems like that's true. It can be difficult to tell the difference between the terms of the beat shifting and like different people becoming informed, different people being able to talk to press, and just a general, like the general whiplash of going from an administration where everybody wanted to leak because everybody had issues to an administration where people very much want to play things close to the chest. The advocacy community wants to like give the incoming administration a chance. So it can be difficult to know how much of that is permanent and how much of it is just people feeling things out. But there can be a real danger when there isn't enough information coming out, because it means that there that an administration that's trying to keep things quiet because it would be politically inconvenient for them if things got out gets to have its way just because people don't. It's hard to put the pieces together and nobody's talking, which is so. I'm hoping that's not going to happen, but it can be a lot harder to justify the importance of the issue when you have neither the supply of information nor necessarily the demand. But as far as the EO strategy, like, it's very useful to think back to the first week of 2017 and the Trump administration's first wave of executive orders, because in addition to the travel ban, there were 2 executive orders, one of which was on border enforcement and one of which was on interior enforcement. And there wasn't a ton of attention paid to like everything that was in there, but these were like multi-page executive orders, some of which didn't really need to happen through executive order. Like, there was no reason that the president needed to tell the Secretary of Homeland Security to look into using Section 35B2C of the INA, but he did. And it was actually very useful that they did that, publicly, because that provision ultimately is what got used for the Remain in Mexico program, or the migrant protection protocols, which started in early 2019 and which resulted in some 20,000 immigrants being given court dates and then sent back to Mexico to wait for a date. So there were lots of little, not necessarily time bombs, but lots of seeds planted in those executive orders for a lot of the administration's actions over the next 4 years. There was some stuff in there that ultimately it led to the family separation policy, the zero tolerance policy of 2018, which is actually why, there was an early clip of Trump's first Homeland Security Secretary, John Kelly, getting asked about the possibility of families getting separated. And that's because he'd said something in his implementing memo for one of those executive orders about, like, this might possibility if we continue to suspect that parents are trafficking their children, into the US. So the policy specificity of those and the scope is not what we saw. I mean, again, like, Immigration Day is coming, but it's not what we saw in the first day orders, right? Instead of a broad memo on border enforcement that included tons of policy changes, there was a memo on halting construction of the border wall. Instead of a memo with several pages of, here is what we need to do to, here are specific categories of people who shouldn't be presumed to be in detention, everybody else you should presume detention. And, that change meant that before the pandemic, we had, just massive numbers of people in ICE custody and very little hope that anybody, a lot more difficult getting bond, a lot higher bonds, a lot more difficult getting released. We had the vague memo about interior enforcement priority, or vague EO about interior enforcement priorities, followed by that memo on, on the deportation memorandum, which also did kind of state broad priorities, but which wasn't by any means policy actionable. And so it's, I don't use the stance, and I don't think that I've reported this out well enough to know that I can answer it for sure, that you do this if you are going to, if you don't want too much of the driving the bus to come from the White House, you can make the argument that you do it as a vision thing, as a statement about the past is over. Like, we're going to take the border, we're going to, like, reverse the border wall. We're going to reverse the travel ban. The one thing that, like, is publicly known for sure about the executive orders coming Friday is that there's going to be some kind of task force on family separations, which presumably would be tasked with taking the few hundred families that have still not been contacted in the litigation that ended family separation and, like, trying to track those down and get those parents and kids back together. Or you could just say that this is what you do if you don't know exactly what you're going to do next, because there is a lot to be undone. A lot of it is on timetables that, like, the genesis for MPP might have come in an executive order, but, like, as it stands, there's a caseload in immigration court. And, like, what do you do with that caseload, especially now that we have a pandemic? What do you do with the people? They suspended new MPP enrollments as of Thursday, but, like, what do you do with those people who are still waiting in Mexico? What do you, like, how do you figure out who gets kept in detention? Are you going to release people from detention during this moratorium? There are like lots of small policy questions. And there's also the bigger problem of institutional cultures, which was the problem of immigration enforcement under Obama, and which was the problem with some of the immigration kind of benefit stances under Trump, is like there are very, very strong cultures at both the enforcement agency, CBP and ICE, and in parts of, and this varies by sector, but like parts of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, where there's a much more customer service benefits minded approach. And so, you know, the last Democratic administration and the new Democratic administration are liable to run into problems with the first two, because efforts to restrict discretion from the top down are going to be seen as efforts to not follow the law. And the Trump administration ran into problems with the last one because, you know, the asylum corps became like extremely outspoken by civil servant standards under the last 2 years of administration, as many of those people felt that their job was to uphold the U.S.'s humanitarian obligation. They were not being allowed to do their jobs. And so building policies that keep people on board who have to be implementing those policies was a massive structural problem under Obama. They spent literally years trying to figure out how to turn memos into things that actually functioned on the ground the way they said they would. And that's the really big question, is like, how quickly, if you spent from 2010 to 2014 trying to do that, you finally figured it out in 2014, and then 2016 happened, everything you did got rescinded, and the message that got sent was whatever you guys think is best to do is best for 4 years. How long does it take to get back to a 2014 place, much less, you know, do anything more radical than that?
Yeah, so I just want to like break in for a second and kind of say that I completely agree. We had one of my good friends, Allegra Love, runs in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a nonprofit.
Oh my gosh.
Oh wait, do you know her or something?
Yes,
oh, sorry.
She's great. She's fantastic. We hung out in El Paso a couple of years ago.
She's been on the show, and she's just like this phenomenal cowboy lawyer that like helps like dreamers. And anyway, she was on the show. But one of the things that she has said, and she's like a very old friend, and what we've been talking over text for a long time about this, and she was kind of saying like she really saw the Trump administration as flashing these immigration issues before the eyes of people. A lot of the interest that was developed and the money that people gave to immigration issues as being actually not representative of the constituency necessarily around people that care about immigration, but people that were like using it as a proxy to hate on Trump. And she was very worried that there was going to be this fall away from the constituency in the new in a Democratic administration of people who no longer saw it as a priority. I mean, that was amidst COVID. So, I mean, I think she was even more, this was pre-Trump not being elected. Again, but I just kind of like, do you have that same concern? I mean, and this is part of like you've been doing this for so long type of like thing, which is just like, do you have that same concern? Do you think that some of like what the administration is trying to do is to use it as kind of as a tool for popular, use it as a tool, and then like aren't going to end up caring about it as much as you would like to see them, or like you think it should be cared about?
I can't speak to the administration's strategy on this, but I think that, like, you know, and this is actually something that I said on the Weeds when we taped it this morning, and so people who listen to both are going to be hearing me say this twice, but one of the things that we have to remind ourselves now that Donald Trump is no longer in office is that most presidents put people into the executive branch and let them do their jobs, and whether or not they personally care about those things doesn't actually impact whether the things are happening. And like, this did happen to a certain extent under Trump. There were definitely whole issue areas where like Donald Trump, with the exception of like the birds and windmills thing, didn't appear to care a whole lot about the like nuances of environmental policy, and yet environmental deregulation still happened. But like, it is reasonable to assume that under a Biden administration, things will happen even on issues where the White House isn't doing that. there is the question of how quickly you're putting people in those positions. And while they are now beginning to put people in some of the like non-Senate confirmation necessary positions, they haven't even announced nominees for any of the heads of the immigration agencies yet.
Yeah.
The secretary nominee, Eli Mayorkas, is like got voted out of committee today, but it's not super clear when his nomination is going to the floor. And so like,
well, we don't have like an attorney general yet officially. Like,
right.
That hasn't even, so like we're a little behind in everything.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. So there is, you know, there is kind of that, but like as far as public opinion, man, like her and I, like we actually, I like recall being very frustrated with her about this when I was in El Paso, because like at that point, people had stopped paying attention to the quote unquote border crisis because kids weren't being held in cages in the US anymore. Instead, people were being expelled back to makeshift camps in Mexico. And the fact that it wasn't on US soil was apparently a very salient distinction for a critical mass of the public. And so the idea that it takes things happening that are both visible and politically sympathetic is, you know, and that's where it comes back to like, it's impossible to lift that stuff up if you don't know for sure that it's happening. Even if you suspect it is, you can't nail it down. And so I do think that there are, you know, I think that we're not going to see the kind of, this is what just happened to my neighbor tweet threads going viral, because there isn't going to be that immediate grassroots appetite for it. And, you know, the question of whether on what level it remains a progressive priority among like elected Democrats may or may not be secondary to that. I will say that frankly, in 2020, elected Democrats were much more interested in ending MPP than the like hashtag resistance appeared to be. And so there does appear to be a certain level of difference in that.
All right. Richard Wattenbarger, the floor is yours.
Hi. So the impression I think that a lot of us have had is that Trump allowed the Border Patrol officers to go wild, so to speak, you know, stepping up the abuse of detainees and the like. You know, I heard stories about how Border Patrol officers would say, oh, this is what we've been waiting for. Our job can become fun. And to the extent that this has been what's the likelihood that the Biden administration is going to be able to get these people under control and get this whole situation under control? I know this is a broad and kind of vague question, but I think we can run with it.
But it goes to the culture issue that
Right.
that Dara was referring to earlier. Yeah. So what about beating CBP into and ICE into cultural submission?
So for one thing, this is where it comes back to, without knowing who's running those agencies, it's really hard. Who's going to be running those agencies, it's really hard to tell. They're definitely, even under the Trump administration, the unions for the enforcement agencies were very particular about who they did and didn't like. And, you know, Brandon Judd of the Border Patrol Union was personally close with Donald Trump and was kind of like setting some of the tone there. But even then, like some of the people who were recycled through CBP and ICE into acting positions over the course of the administration, kind of known to not be favorites of the field. Nobody got voted, like nobody had a vote of no confidence passed against them, like Obama's head of ICE did in 2010 when he sent a first memo saying, hey, maybe, you know, parents of United States citizens shouldn't be your top priority in deportation. The ICE union said, you know, we don't have any faith in your leadership anymore. But there, you know, that didn't even go away, even under like the most maximally favorable president. So the idea that an Obama nominee is, or that a Biden nominee is going to like come in and they're going to be like, oh, yep, turning over a new leaf. Like, there definitely are people, and you know, I know that the message is being sent from middle management that like our mission is still the same, especially at Border Patrol where they haven't had changes of policy yet, like nothing, you know, continuity of government, all that jazz. But it's been hard enough to get accountability for abuses at the agencies. This was something that that Obama's second term CBP commissioner, Gil Kerlikowske, put a lot of work into with regards to use of force, and actually like got some work done there. But there have been complaints about the CBP abuses since, way before there was a CBP, since it was U.S. Border Patrol under the Immigration and Naturalization Service. There is a long history there of people feeling that they are holding the line. And so that's tricky in a different way than the way in which ICE is tricky, because ICE has the issue of being an agency that was carved out where there hadn't really been anything with an internal culture before, carved out under Bush, and that it's not really clear what the agency's function, what enforcement and removal operations, which is one of the main components of ICE, would do in a world where the president didn't think that aggressive enforcement of immigration laws was important.
All right. David Botts, you have outdone yourself today. The floor is yours, either in your own form or in that of Bernie Sanders.
All right. Well, my Bernie impersonation is vocally kind of weak, so I will be myself this time. But Dara, thanks so much for visiting us. This is a sort of a related cultural question, and that is, what are your thoughts about how the mood and attitude of the U.S. population has changed concerning immigration over the last 4 years? And what steps and measures would you recommend to the Biden administration?
Not doing that one. I'm a journalist, not a commentator. As far as like how it's changed over the last 4 years, I think Kate really nailed it at the beginning of this episode, that attention to immigration, or whatever she said, pointed this out, that attention to immigration really ebbs and flows. It's very news dependent. Like, if you look at the Gallup, most important issue question charted, it's for like months at a time will be like something between 6 and 10% of people will say immigration. And then something will happen in the news and that'll shoot up to the mid-teens or higher. And then, or 2 months later, it'll go back down again. So for me, it's difficult to talk coherently about public opinion around immigration while understanding that most people aren't thinking about it actively and might be thinking about it differently if they did. Like, most of the time, the reasons that it becomes salient are because people are aware that there is some kind of like crisis. The unaccompanied children crisis of summer 2014 was one example of this. There was some attention to the migrant caravans going into the 2018 midterms. Like, in those cases, it's not unreasonable to believe that people who, if you ask them in a vacuum, might say, well, of course, it's very important for us to hold, to allow people to apply for asylum, to uphold humanitarian ideals, but in practice say, but there are just too many of them, we have to stop them all from coming. Conversely, I think a lot of people who thought of themselves as there was definitely a period during which even kind of elected Republicans who had been immigration hawks were separating families was a massively inhumane policy, despite the fact that, separating families is what happens when you deport people too, or for that matter, put people in jail. And so there was an extent to which public opinion was softer on that sub-issue than it is generally. So like, it's not super easy to know whether what we've seen in polls, which is that there is a broad liberalization of, Democrats in particular are much more pro-immigration than they were 4 years ago. Americans in general, a little bit more on it. More people are willing to say we'll have more immigrants than fewer. Like, yeah, it's harder for me to assume that any of that is either durable or that it's politically salient. It's hard for me to look at any of those poll numbers and go, oh, it's politically much easier for Biden to legalize 11 million people than it was for Obama, because I can't look at that and say that would stay the same at the end of a drawn-out congressional fight on the issue.
Yeah, I think that that's a really wonderful point. I do think that there has been, I think that it's not that I want there. I mean, it's in fact the opposite. I don't want to discount and cared about like immigration as a reform issue for a very long time, and as a human rights issue, and as an economic issue, and all of these things. And what I'm like concerned with is the trivialization that it will like happen because it becomes about babies in cages and not these broader things, and because people forget that, like as you said, like that is not actually an exceptional thing. People are separated from their children through the state all the time in horrible ways, and so it's about kind of conceiving of like better and deeper and longer lasting reforms that are more adept at dealing with kind of these inadequacies on the surface. Brian, so nice to see you. I like your background. What is that?
Oh, thank
Is
you.
that what's going on there?
Well, just
Ooh.
we've got a melange of different things, from travels and gifts and
Excellent.
Africa, Nicaragua. I think this is from
That looks.
Zambia
Oh,
and Mexico.
and
Cool.
where are you? Presumably not in any of those places right now.
Downtown Minneapolis.
Oh, nice.
Excellent. Where it is what temperature?
I think it's around 15 degrees currently.
You could have just
That's not
made
too
something
bad.
up. I know.
I know it's not supposed to get above 20 this week, so.
Oh, well, there
You
you
know,
go.
as long as it's above 0, you're doing pretty well for this time of year for Minneapolis.
For January, this is actually quite moderate, so
Yeah.
I'll take it.
All right, what's on your mind?
Well, Dara, I am a practitioner in immigration law. I am now in my 20th. I just started my 20th year this past October.
Are you familiar with the Bloomington Immigration Court, where I did my undergraduate thesis research?
Yeah, I did not realize that now labeled the Fort Snelling Immigration Court.
Oh, right. Sorry.
It's been relabeled. Yes, it was in Bloomington in that lovely god-awful office court. Yes, I've been practicing there, although we haven't been in court since March because of COVID.
Right.
So,
Right.
So it's been interesting to say the least, and no signs of when it will resume at any time. So at any rate, I was just curious as to what your take is on the immigration bar collectively, realizing you're not a psychologist, you're not a therapist, but you see a lot of us on Twitter, and we had a lot of things to say over the course of the last 4 years about the Great Orange One and his chaos. I think smarter people than I have documented and commented on the cruelty was only tempered by the incompetence of his administration. And I said for probably the greater part of the last year leading up to the election that if he were to be reelected, that I would sincerely be considering an exit out of the practice of immigration law. So what's your take on the current mental state of the immigration bar as we exit out of a Trump administration and transition into a Biden administration? Is it hopeful, anxious, chaotic?
I think that you guys, like I would say, by people, journalists, like both of us have a lot of unprocessed secondary trauma because both of us are motivated by the knowledge that we are not the people we're worried about, and therefore we shouldn't be paying too much attention to our feelings, when of course that's not how psychology works. And so I don't, I think that a lot of that the transition might have been the closest thing to a breather that people were going to get, and even that, like, as you I'm sure know, they were putting out new regulations every week, but there isn't going to be a hey, we're going to step back and just not do anything on immigration for a week and let everybody take the week off thing. Like, even we were all waiting until 10:30 on inauguration night when, like, the Bidens, were doing the like primetime television celebration, and there were fireworks going out like off outside my window, and like only then did they drop the text of the Pekoski memo, and like, oh, the deportation moratorium is happening, and it's 10:30 p.m. on a federal holiday, and like I genuinely thought that they would at least be doing things during business hours. So and we spent all weekend waiting for this ruling out of Texas. There's going to be a lot of that. I don't know how people handle it. I think that honestly, the responses I'm seeing are a range of like the more radical folks are understanding that the lawyering part isn't going to lead to like the transformative change that they want, and more attention to organizing and more attention to like non-litigation strategies for making change. But among everybody else, like I think that there is a certain amount of wait and see. Like I could talk about like the new ER portal that just dropped, and questions about whether the kind of baseline competency or baseline functionality of like the way that an immigration lawyer interacts with the system, those things may or may not improve, may or may not change on any particular timeline. And that is probably what's going to be more important in the absence of radical change for being of your poll. Maybe
all right.
Mine.
So before we go to the next question, I just want to say there are a lot of comments about the degree of internet latency that we're experiencing right now. And we think this is being caused by the general Verizon outage up and down the East Coast. It may be affecting Dara more than it's affecting Kate and me. It's definitely affecting some of you all. There is absolutely nothing we can do about it. And I just remind you that the tech glitches are part of the show on In Lieu of Fun. And if you want a show with no tech glitches,
they're the charm.
You got your CNN, you got your MSNBC, you got your Fox News, if your tastes go that way. You got a lot of options. If you come here, we're going to have tech glitches. And these ones actually, a lot of them are our fault. These ones actually aren't. So just chill on the tech glitches side. James, the floor is yours.
Nice to see you, James.
Hello. I'm not at the store. I have today off, so I was like,
yeah, nice.
Oh, I'm gonna sit on a couch actually.
I like the bulletin board.
I like it too.
Yeah.
What does IJ stand for?
My wife's
the
name
I
is
his wife. And then the
yep,
J is
Irene.
James.
Perfect, Kate.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, it's like a bunch of our travels and like family and stuff, so it's nice at our little house here. But Miss Lind, I just wanted to ask you really quickly, and more of a because not necessarily an opinion piece as a journalist, but just sort of, I believe DACA was instituted in 2012. Am I wrong?
Mm-hmm. Nope, you're right.
Yeah? Okay. All right. And I also, being just interested in elections, I also thought of like the political choice Obama was making then, knowing like, he could have something to, to sell to the base a little bit before November. But I just wanted to ask you, for pro-immigration reform advocates, is it viewed as successful? Is it viewed as something that's been successful, or is it viewed as this sort of temporary, maybe a little bit of a kicking the can down the road, for lack of a better description?
Great question.
I mean, nobody who pushed for DACA would be satisfied with DACA still being the thing in 20 years. I mean, not least because like it's a particular cohort of people, but also because it's, it's not ideal. And it's not like it was unanticipated when Obama announced it in 2012 that if a Republican got elected in 2017, they would try to undo the program. It actually, the political reaction in 2012 was muted in a way that I think made it easier to assume that that this was a politically, a more fraught fight for a Republican to pick than some others, but like it was still known that, the nature of an administrative program is the next administration can change it. But what I will say is like something I return to a bunch is that historically speaking in America, we have not had an immigrant population that is as socially integrated and legally isolated as the unauthorized population right now. Because like there are various legal reasons for this, but like it was typical until a few decades ago that if you were in the United States for a long enough period of time, even if you didn't have papers, you could through a backdoor regularize your status. And like that hasn't really existed in a real way since 1996, and it was even easier than that a couple of decades before that. So what we have right now is the kind of DACA generation, the 1.5 generation, if you will, are now like young adults. Like I'm not even young adults, like early to mid-career folks. Like I'm pretty squarely in the DACA cohort, and I'm not even sure. I'm like not sure that I can call myself a young person anymore. I'm probably too old to like sticking my tongue out on Zoom calls, even though I still do it. But they
Sarah,
often,
you're
their
totally
parents
fine. You're
are
like,
often
you're
still in
like,
the US.
yes. Sorry. You're solidly like, I get
But like,
made fun of for saying how young I am on these things all the time. But I think that I think we're the same age or close. So, you can also stick your tongue
I think
out
you got
as long as you
a
want.
few years on me. But like, so obviously the DACA generation, their parents were living in the US. Some of them may have been deported, some of them may have given up, but like many of them are still here. Many of them have grandparents who are here. And many of them at this point have children, like aren't infant children. And the children who were born in the US are US citizens, but maybe everybody else is unauthorized. And so even having the kind of protection of temporary, deportation protections and the temporary ability to work has been, and there is like social science and survey data backing this up, has been really helpful, not just for being able to like themselves go to college and get better, career path jobs and get mortgages and all of that, but to help to kind of formalize something that has been socially true, which is that, like, they're acting as de facto interpreters for their parents. They're acting as the mediator whenever their parents have to deal with officials because it's safer to put somebody out there who has papers. So that has been a tremendously beneficial thing for that population.
Oh, James Heckle, Ben is muted, but he forgot. And so,
am I unmuted? Ben is muted,
I am
but
no
am I
longer
unmuted?
muted. I just want to say, with the exception of Katie Fang, you are the best dressed person.
No, John Bordeaux wore a fucking tux.
That's true. With the exception of Katie Fang and John Bordeaux, who wore evening wear on In Lieu of Fun.
Very nice.
You are the best dressed person to have appeared on the show, and probably the only one with a lapel pin. The floor is yours.
Oh yeah, it's a special KCRW
Excellent.
lapel pin. I can't read it,
Oh,
but it says
excellent.
"Good Lawyer."
Oh, so you're a Pope hat fan.
Yes, I'm a fanboy of Ken. So anyway, my question is about H-1B visas in particular, and it's been a unique bonding experience for me and my wife. She's a non-lawyer, but works with H-1B visas for a large public university. So it's been a lot of fun explaining to her and helping her interpret, executive orders and injunctions, and why, federal court injunctions, affect one part of the country and not other parts or the entire country. It's been a lot of fun for me. And fragment alerts have been especially helpful. But I was wondering if you could perhaps make a guess on what we can expect for this, visa categories going forward.
I mean, first we're gonna have to see whether they a lot of last minute regulations got pushed through to H-1B. They're squarely, as far as I can tell, within the window that Congress can, it's congressional review if it so chooses. I don't have any particular intel on whether those regs would be on the list. I kind of assume they would. They seemed awfully, those regulations seemed awfully broad and awfully hastily done. But because the Congressional Review Act has something, I don't fully understand the legal mechanism for this, but it's essentially a salt the earth provision that once something gets struck down via CRA, you like can't make other regulations in that space either. And not just like you couldn't regulate the H-1B program, but like it just couldn't be, similar enough that I don't really know how they're going to navigate that. I think that a lot of this, frankly, goes to, is USCIS going to start functioning again, right? The fact, like, 2020 was a wild year for a lot of reasons, but the fact that there was not a lot of attention to the agency that processes legal immigration applications having to potentially like furlough 70% of its workforce because it realized it had $1 billion shortfall in the middle of the year, like that probably could have stood to get a little more attention. They managed to like find some money in the couch cushions essentially, but it raised a lot of questions about the level of transparency at USCIS around budgeting in particular, but also like there is just a lot that is under scrutinized about that agency because it is fee funded. And so Congress doesn't have oversight levers over it the way it does with appropriated agencies. And I am interested, it isn't super clear because of that opacity to what extent getting different people in charge of USCIS is going to fix some of the kind of processing delays, some of the requests for evidence increases, some of the, some of the vetting stuff. And like, we'll see.
No, we lost Oz, but okay.
But yeah, I genuinely, I wish I could help you.
Ben, you're muted. Ben, you're muted. Ben, you're muted.
Sorry. People yell at me when I type, which is usually really in loudly. Communication. Yeah. Well, you type really loudly too.
I know.
So I try to remember to mute myself, but then I forget to unmute myself. And so I end up. Anyway, Oz, you get the last question today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Given the large number of Trump loyalties, COVID still being real, high unemployment, DACA, what do you think the impact and the focus on high immigration policies is going to be in 2022? We can't have, can we have an open policy for all immigrants? So it's an interesting question. So thank you for taking my question.
Yeah, of course. Also, I like that tree.
Man, like how anybody is going to be able to predict, like I really, one of the things I really appreciate about being a journalist is that I do not have to make predictions about the future. Because, like, come on, could any of us have predicted 2 years ago what any of this was going to be? But I think that there are ways in which the pandemic has kind of thrown politics for a loop that we're now seeing play out, and there are ways that it hasn't played out yet. It's been very interesting to see the discourse over essential workers, because for ages, the conventional wisdom on immigration reform was it's politically sympathetic to talk about the DACA kids, because like kids, all those UK cases grew up in the US. It's politically sympathetic to talk about, people with temporary protected status because they've been in the US for decades and they've been able to work here. And it's less politically sympathetic to talk about like quote unquote low skilled, low wage immigrants, even though even though there is a Washington consensus that they keep the American economy going, that's not an argument that you can get a lot of enthusiastic support for as a way to do legalization. And now all of a sudden, like those are the exact same people who are now being called essential workers. Immigrants are overrepresented in, a lot of the kind of domestic service home care categories, in the healthcare industry. And the idea of you should be valorized for your work is something that we just haven't seen applied to these tiers of jobs in like living memory. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that has bigger effects on the politics of immigration. There is kind of most explicitly some energy among advocates for legalization for essential workers. Whether that plays out and how it plays out is unclear. But even if there isn't kind of a like legalization bill added to a COVID relief package, which I know is kind of the dream scenario for advocates who don't want to have to get Republican votes for an immigration reform bill. Even without that, it's totally plausible that we could be talking about immigration in a way that doesn't, that instead of glossing over the number of immigrants, like low-skilled jobs, in fact, kind of embraces that.
All right, before we let you go, we have a question in the YouTube chat, which I usually ignore, but I didn't today. Wants an explanation of your sweatshirt, which
which has played out in the chat aside.
Which I have answered in the chat, but I suspect there are other people who are confused by the future is TK. So explain it for us.
So TK is journalistic shorthand for to come. It's essentially what you put in when you like just are filing your copy and you don't have a fact hand or haven't gotten a quote back yet. I do it with job titles all the damn time because I know that if I'm just writing through in my file, I'm gonna pull something out of my hat that will turn out to be wrong. And I should do it with organization names more frequently because that happens too. I don't. You know why it's TK, right? Rather than because TK never appears in the English language in that sequence. Yes, I had heard that. I believe that this rule must have happened. This convention must have come at some point before Jews started being overrepresented in journalism, because like no one who's ever had a latke, right. I have done Control F in a Hanukkah piece that I wrote for Vox, and it was like lit up like a Christmas tree, so to speak. But lit up like a Hanukkah, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah,
so let's put it differently. Yeah, Goyim don't use it.
Kate, I also do the multiple TKs at once thing, and then I like go through my file and
it's like don't you think it's like a tip? It's very cathartic. I put it
in all the time. Like also like you'll be writing along and you just don't want to pause to address something. So you're like, this happened on date TK. This happened with
Twitter has banned TK people. Like
exactly.
I just like type in TK and then I'm like, okay, I'll go back and look it up.
And you go through you search for all your TKs and then you add them. Yeah.
It's really efficient.
Can I tell you my favorite TK story, which is also my favorite pre-write story? Okay. So as has been kind of publicly known and discussed during the Trump administration, resignation pre-writes became a thing because like there was so much turnover and you didn't want to be one person who didn't have something ready to go and Scott Pruitt left the EPA. There at Vox, we had we were like Vox has a smaller politics staff than I think a lot of people understand, and so a few of us were responsible for a lot of things, and so keeping the pre-writes current was a challenge. And at one point, a colleague of mine went into a file for I'm pretty sure John Kelly when he was chief of staff, and had to totally write through the file because it was assuming the last time it had been updated, it was assuming he was resigning over something that like long passed. And so they wrote through the file and then came to the end and said, but he could not withstand TK whatever he could not withstand. End of file.
Well, I mean, I have literally TK'd like a lot of op-eds that like I just don't know how to end them. And I like leave it to my editor. I'm like, have fun, TK. Like I was like, you just wrap it up. I don't know where to end this, land it. Like, I don't know.
It's been around a while. Anyway, that is the journal. The other one that people use is CHK, which means check. But I think that one's a little bit less common. All right, Dara Lind, you are a great American, even with the internet latency that keeps making you turn into a blue or purplish blue square. We love having you, and come back soon. Our guest tomorrow to celebrate the week of Burns Night, which was yesterday, will be Len Penny. Scottish nationalist poet, internet sensation, Twitter sensation, and the proprietor of the Scots Word of the Day Twitter feed. We will have simultaneous translation for those who need it, who don't. I'm kidding about that.
Oh.
We won't
I actually was like, you did? That's amazing.
Yeah, no. I told Len that
It wouldn't be simultaneous with the lag, though.
No, I told Len that she has to be her own simultaneous translation, and she can speak in as deep Scots as she wants, but she has to be able to code switch so that people can understand her. And I think we have an understanding about this, and so that's going to be tomorrow. It'll be 22 hours and 54 minutes from now, and until then, we don't have fun anymore. But we do have, as ever, immigration policy in flux. Some things never change, even when they change. We will see you tomorrow. Dara, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us,
guys.
Dara. Great